second here.
Thank you.
And you're on. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm Mark Bancroft, Director of Planning and Development Services for the Municipality of Thames Centre. I'd like to welcome all attendees and viewers to this public consultation session with respect to the proposed Parkland dedication bylaw. This session is being conducted over Zoom and also broadcasted over Thames Centre's YouTube channel. The municipality has retained Watson and Associates, and specifically Daryl Abs, who has prepared a detailed Parkland dedication memorandum along with the proposed bylaw, both of which are posted on the municipality's website under one single document. Daryl will provide a presentation including an overview of the proposed bylaw and will be available to answer any questions that our attendees may have. So to date, I would like to acknowledge that we have received written submissions from Siffin Properties and also a joint submission from the Thames Valley District School Board and the London Catholic District School Board. Daryl, if you could please go ahead with your presentation, that would be great.
Will do. Thank you very much, Mark. Appreciate that introduction. And thank you everyone for attending this session this afternoon. So I've prepared a small presentation slide deck to kind of guide the discussion. Happy to answer any questions as I go if you wanted to jump in, or we can save those questions for the end, whatever works best. If we go to the next slide, so I think as just an agenda, I think what we'll start off with is a brief overview of the legislation. We'll talk about just Parkland policies in general, what the current policy and practice is in the municipality. And then what we'll do is just provide a summary of the analysis and some of the observations that we've provided as part of our Parks Plan memorandum. And then we'll talk about if there's any next steps for council to consider a bylaw, and then happy to answer any questions. Next slide, please. And so Parkland dedication is really utilized to ensure that the municipalities providing parks services, their system is growing in tandem with the development in the municipality. And so we impose Parkland dedication requirements through the Planning Act to recover parkland or payment in lieu of parkland. And one of the things to keep in mind as a consideration as we're going through this process is that there's been some changes to the legislation as a result of Bill 23. And so if you recall, Bill 23 made changes to the Development Charges Act and to the Planning Act, which really reduces the municipality's ability to recover as much parkland or payment in lieu of parkland as previously was possible. Next slide, please. And so why are we looking at these policies? For a couple of reasons. I think, firstly, when we're looking at Parks and Recreation master plans or other documents, there might be a target set out for the municipality. So for example, perhaps we're looking to achieve 7 acres of parkland for every 1,000 people. What the review has done is really looking at the financial impact of this. And so if we take a look at our current inventory and we take the development forecast that we've identified and we apply the Parkland dedication policies that we have or that we're allowed to impose as per the Planning Act, will we be able to meet those that standard at the end of our forecast period? So that's one reason. Another reason is, again, in light of those discounts and exemptions that are applied to not just Parkland dedication, but development charges, those other revenue tools, maximizing recovery of Parkland dedication will help minimize the impact on taxpayers as a result of that bill. Okay. Additionally, a parkland dedication bylaw is required to utilize some of the provisions of the Planning Act, the alternative rate, which I'll talk about in a moment. Next slide, please. And so our Parks Plan memorandum, the analysis is set out in that memo dated January 7th. And as Mark noted, that's on the municipality's website. Included in that is a draft parkland dedication bylaw in Appendix D. Again, taking into account all of the feedback from the public consultation, from the submissions. We'll work with staff to bring forward a final parkland dedication bylaw for council's consideration. And next slide, please. And next slide. So there's really three sections of the Planning Act which cover parkland dedication. I think Section 51.1 speaks to subdivisions. Section 53 speaks to consents. They're very similar. So we'll just speak to Section 51.1 when it talks about subdivisions, but note that they're very similar to Section 53 for consents. And then we'll compare that to Section 42 of the Planning Act. So Section 51.1 applies to subdivisions. There's no bylaw required, but you impose parkland dedication requirements as a condition of approval. And so what it says is you can charge up to, or you can require dedication of land up to 5% of the land for residential or institutional developments and 2% for commercial or industrial developments. Now you can either take the land as dedication, or you can receive payment in lieu of the land dedication. For residential development, you can either impose that 5% requirement, or there's the ability to impose this alternative rate, which is 1 hectare of land for every 600 net residential units that are developed. If you're going to take payment in lieu, instead, it's 1 hectare of land for 1,000 units. Now, the key thing here is when we're looking at the payment in lieu, we're going to take the cash equivalent of the land. Then the timing of the valuation of the land is the day before approval of the draft plan. When we look at Section 42, this now applies to all development and redevelopment in the municipality. You need a bylaw to impose this, but you can impose the same requirements, the 5%, the 2%. You can take the land or the cash equivalent of the land. The key difference here is that the timing of the valuation of the land is the day before the building permit. Okay, so this would be a fully serviced lot, which would have a much higher value than it would earlier on in the process, the day before the draft plan. Okay, so those are the two key distinctions. Next slide, please. And so with Bill 23, it brought in a number of changes to the legislation, restrictions, exemptions, discounts, really to align the parkland dedication policies with the Development Charges Act. And so similar to development charges, if I proceed through development process with a site plan or zoning bylaw amendment application, my rate is frozen at the time I submit my complete application. There's exemptions for these additional residential units. So I can add up to 2 units in a single, semi, or townhouse, and I don't have to pay development charges. They're also excluded from parkland dedication as well. There's exemptions for affordable and attainable units, understanding that those are still to be defined under the Development Charges Act. They're also still to be defined then for parkland dedication. And then there's also an exemption for nonprofit housing units. So those units, if they're exempt, they're all excluded from the calculations. There's a requirement to allocate 60% of the monies in the Parkland Reserve Fund at the beginning of the year. Again, similar to development charges. Now, the key thing here, and this may not impact the municipality currently, but in the future, when higher density development starts to come more so to the municipality, what they've done is they've cut in half this alternative rate, right? And so on the previous slide I mentioned, you can either require 5% of the land from residential, or you can require 1 hectare for every 600 net residential units. It used to be 300 units. For payment in lieu, so if you're going to take the cash, it used to be 500 units, now it's 1,000. Okay. In addition to kind of cutting that in half, they also put a cap on top of that, which basically says instead of the 5%, you can use the alternative rate, but it can be no more than 10% if the land is 5 hectares or less, or 15% if it's a larger plot of land greater than 5 hectares. There's a requirement to undertake a parks plan before you pass a parkland dedication bylaw, which is what we're doing now. And then as well, there's the potential for encumbered lands to be included as part of land dedication. Now, to date, this section has not yet been enforced, but you can see on the provincial website under the Planning Act that this section has been identified for inclusion at a later date. Next slide, please. And next slide. And so as part of the Parks Plan memorandum, the analysis, what have we done to kind of estimate our future needs? And so what we've done is we've said, okay, well, what's our population target at the end of our forecast period? And what's that standard of parkland per 1,000 people? Well, if we multiply those together, we can see, well, at the end of our forecast period, how much parkland will we actually need? On the bottom half of the schematic, you can see if we start with the current inventory, then we add in the development forecast multiplied by those parkland dedication or payment in lieu policies, we can see how much future parkland we could get to at the end of the forecast. And if there's a gap between those two numbers, that means we won't be able to achieve our standards with just using parkland dedication. And if we want to meet our standards, we'll have to use tax funding to fill in that gap. Okay. Next slide, please. So I already mentioned this, that if you proceed through a site plan or zoning bylaw application, your rate is frozen at the time you submit your application, similar to development charges. And so this means if you're using Section 42 of the Planning Act, which says that the value of the land is determined the day before building permit, you would need to get an appraisal done to say, well, what are those equivalent value of properties the day before building permit, and then lock that rate in when you submit your application. Next slide, please. So I mentioned the reduced alternative rate for residential parkland dedication, and these little charts here just show you that if you want to calculate what's the break-even point, if I want to use 5%, because the Act says I can either use 5% dedication or I can require the alternative rate of 1 hectare for every 600 units. So I get to, the municipality can choose. So what should we choose? And so you can look at that break-even point, which identifies 30 units per hectare. And so when density is more than 30 units per hectare, then there'll be more dedication provided if you use the alternative rate. If you're taking the cash through payment in lieu, the density is 50 units per hectare. Next slide, please. And just to provide an example of the losses here, or the potential reduction, if we had a property that was 1 hectare and we had apartment units that might look something like in the picture where there's 120 units, we have a density of 120 units per hectare. So under the old rules, before Bill 23, we could get the cash equivalent of 0.24 hectares. Because they cut it in half, we can only get the cash equivalent of 0.12 hectares. And because they capped it at 10%, now we can only get 0.1 hectare. Okay, so you can see when you apply the value of the land to this, that it is restricting how much payment in lieu you can receive to help you achieve your parkland targets. Next slide, please. So I mentioned those exemptions, the additional residential units, nonprofit, affordable, attainable units. they are now removed from the calculation. So quite simply, if I had a 100-unit subdivision and I had 10 of those units are exempt, they meet the affordable definition, then that would say that 90% of the units times the 5% means rather than getting 5% dedication, the municipality can only require 4.5% dedication. So again, just reducing what you can require as part of the Parkland dedication process. Next slide, please. And then some of those other items I mentioned had more of an administrative impact. More of a minor impact is just requirement to allocate monies in the reserve fund at the beginning of the year. Next slide, please. And next slide. And so the official plan identifies that for residential development, the municipality will request whatever is greater, either 5% of the land for residential developments, or utilize that alternative rate of 1 hectare of land for each 300 dwelling units, which now, as per Bill 23, is now 600 dwelling units. For non-residential development, it identifies 2% dedication for industrial and commercial developments. Next slide, please. And so for payment in lieu of parkland dedication, there's kind of a couple different approaches here for consents and severances. So if you're building, let's say, 1 or 2 houses, then the municipality would impose a rate of $4,000 per lot for residential development or $1,600 per lot for non-residential development. Otherwise, the municipality would impose the equivalent value of 5% of the land for residential and 2% for commercial industrial. And again, has that ability to impose that alternative rate of 1 hectare of land for each. Now it's 1,000 net residential units. Next slide, please. And so as part of this review, we wanted to take a look at that per lot fee. And so again, the intent of that fee per lot is to say, well, if I have a consent or severance and I have, it's just I'm building 1 house, we don't want to require an appraisal to be undertaken, so we'll just have a per lot fee established. And so under Section 42 of the Planning Act, remember the value of the land is the day before building permit. And so if we take a look at that $4,000 per lot, that would be like saying the equivalent lot value is about $80,000, right? Because we can require 5% of the value of the land. So what we did was we took a look at some lots in the municipality, the value of the lots, again, the day before building permit. And if we were to apply the 5% value, it's showing that 5% value would equate to something more like $10,000 per lot. So not necessarily suggesting that we go right to 10,000. However, we just wanted to identify this so that you have full information that if we were to apply the 5% to everyone, then those lots would be imposed about $10,000 per lot. Next slide, please. And next slide. So in terms of looking at the additional parkland required, the municipality's 2023 master plan identified a service level of 3.9 hectares of parkland for every 1,000 residents. And so if we look at the anticipated population in 2046, it would suggest that we need about 82.8 hectares of parkland. The current inventory is about 57.1, which means we would need to add about 25.7 hectares of parkland. Or sorry, hectares of parkland. Next slide, please. And so under the current, what we've done as part of the analysis, and you'll see in the memo, is we've looked at a couple different scenarios. And so if we look at your current policy, your current approach of the 5% dedication for residential and 2% for commercial industrial, versus 5% for residential and institutional and 2% for commercial industrial, versus what if we utilize that alternative rate for residential development to see what are the anticipated acres or hectares that would be dedicated through the new development. And you can see, and if we just look at the hectares on the bottom row, it ranges from about 4.85 hectares on the low end to 5.28 hectares. Next slide, please. And so similarly, if we said, and we looked at the development, we assumed everyone paid through payment in lieu, how much revenue would be provided through Parkland dedication. And what we see is if we applied that per lot fee to all residential development, we would receive about $9 million. But if we're applying that 5% and 2% rates based on what we can impose as per the legislation, it would be about $19.5 million. Next slide, please. And so as part of the memo, we did a sensitivity analysis and looked at what the municipality may receive from new development. But when the municipality is going to purchase parkland, a conservative estimate would be to assume that it's purchased at the value of the lots the day before building permit, so based on the analysis. But alternative assumptions have been provided in the memo to identify the funds that would be needed to purchase the 25.7 hectares of parkland to meet those standards. So on the next slide, please. So we've taken a look to see through these different scenarios, the value of the land that would be required to meet those service levels. And so you can see if we were to use scenario 1 and we assumed the value of land that was being dedicated was $4.13 million per hectare, or about 1.7 million per acre, what that suggests is that the total of value of land required by the municipality, if we were going to purchase that, would be pretty significant. And so what we've done is just some sensitivity to say, because I know that the value of land is going to differ depending on the area. At the high end, if we were to assume that it was about 1.7 million per acre, there'd be a significant need. If we look at the low end, which is scenario 4, and we assume it's down to about $200,000 per acre, that's where we would see that the municipality would have a surplus of lands if we're purchasing land for only $200,000 per acre. So what this analysis shows, and I know it's a lot of numbers, is really that in most of the scenarios, or almost all of the scenarios, there will be a deficit of land. If we're going to purchase or receive parkland as payment in lieu, there will most likely be a deficit if we're trying to achieve that service level set out in the master plan. Next slide, please. And so the general observations here, and I only have a couple slides left, is really that, again, in light of Bill 23 and in light of some of these restrictions, that the municipality could maximize the recovery of parkland dedication by utilizing Section 42 of the Planning Act, passing a bylaw, and imposing the 5% dedication rate on residential development and institutional development, and 2% for the commercial and industrial development. Okay, if we're looking at that per lot fee, that historical per lot fee is lower than 5% of the values of land the day before building permit, so that fee can be reviewed and increased. Next slide, please. And so that's what the preliminary recommendations are, and those preliminary recommendations are set out in the draft bylaw as well. And so for the what we would suggest is that the municipality would utilize the alternative rates as per the official plan, where the alternative rate provides for more dedication. And then what we've identified here is that consider revising the OP to identify that 5% dedication rate for institutional developments. And so understanding that currently the official plan does not identify dedication for institutional developments, although it is allowed in the Planning Act, it's not identified in the official plan. So I think the initial draft bylaw would suggest that we wouldn't impose it on institutional until the official plan is updated to reflect that policy change. In terms of payment in lieu, utilizing those per lot rates for consents and severances only, and then consider increasing that per lot fee subject to indexing as well. And then consider revising the official plan again to include 5% for institutional development. Next slide, please. And so before passing the Parkland dedication bylaw, we're having this consultation session. This is a mandatory requirement of the Planning Act. And so we're holding this consultation session to get feedback. And as Mark said, we've already received some written feedback, so that's great. I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, we're going to take all this feedback from the engagement session, work with staff, and come back to council with a recommended draft Parkland dedication bylaw for council's consideration. So thank you for your time. Happy to answer any questions anyone has.
If it's okay with you now, I could bring over members from the public to speak.
Yeah, I think this would be a good time, Sarah. Thank you.
Hi, Gary, can you hear us? Okay,
Gary,
we also, oh, sorry, Mark. We also have Tom Heeman. He's in here as an attendee. Hang on one second. Hi, Tom, can you hear us?
Yep. Hello.
Hi, you're on.
All right. Just out of pure ignorance, what expenses are eligible for parkland fees? Is it strictly for land, or is it equipment? Is it capital infrastructure?
So I can take that one. Thanks, Tom. Yeah, so in the Planning Act under Section 42, it does talk about what the municipality is allowed to use the money for. And so you're right, it's not just for parkland itself, purchasing land, it's also for the rehabilitation of existing park assets and purchase of vehicles and equipment as well.
So no facilities.
I think it can be used for facilities as well, the rehabilitation of the assets and the facilities in there. Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Tom, do you have any other questions or comments?
No, that's all I got.
Okay, so we have Gary, if you wish to speak, could you please raise your hand using the Zoom function?
I'm here.
We can hear you. Thank you.
Okay. Most of my questions have been answered. Section 42 covers single family lots basically. and section 50, what is it, 51 or 52, whatever it is, that covers plans of subdivision. I got a question there. Right now, there's an application for about 19 acres in Thorndale, and they don't really have enough room to give you 5% parkland. So if they pay the parkland fees, what's that based on?
So currently, so if they don't have enough room to provide that 5% of the land area, then if they provide land, then the difference between what the 5% would be and what they provided would be provided through payment in lieu. And correct me if I'm wrong, Mark, but my understanding is currently that they'd be imposed based on the value the day before the draft plan of subdivision.
Okay, thank you.
Gary, do you have any other questions or comments?
No, that's all. Thank you.
Thank you. That concludes the public meeting portion.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Daryl, for your presentation. There was a lot of information that you shared. There were a lot of complexities, a lot of numbers, but nevertheless, I appreciate your expertise this afternoon in terms of sharing your findings. So in terms of next steps, all feedback received from the engagement session will be reviewed, and a recommended parkland dedication bylaw will be forwarded to municipal council for consideration. So I want to thank all audience members, attendees for showing up this afternoon as part of this session. Thank you very much. And yeah, thank you.